Every new technology follows the same invisible clock. From electricity to automobiles, from telephones to smartphones, the pattern repeats with mechanical precision. The innovation appears, a few adventurous souls adopt it, momentum builds slowly, then suddenly the entire world changes, and within a predictable window of time, what was once revolutionary becomes ordinary. The question that should fascinate anyone watching technology markets today is not whether this pattern exists, but why it takes exactly the time that it does. Because when you understand the mechanism, when you see the forces that determine how long transformation requires, you can identify which technologies are about to cross the threshold from interesting novelty to dominant force. And that knowledge, that ability to see what's coming while others are still debating whether it matters, that's where extraordinary opportunities emerge. In 1962, a sociologist named Everett Rogers published a book that would become the foundation for understanding how innovations spread through society. Rogers wasn't studying technology specifically. He was examining how Iowa farmers adopted hybrid corn seeds in the 1930s and 40s. What he discovered was a pattern so consistent, so mathematically predictable, that it would apply to virtually every significant innovation that followed. The farmers didn't all adopt the new seeds at once, they adopted in waves. First came the innovators, about 2.5% of the farming community. These were the risk-takers, the experimenters, the farmers who had larger operations and could afford to test unproven methods. They tried the hybrid seeds when most of their neighbours thought they were wasting money and time. Then came the early adopters, another 13.5%. These were respected farmers, opinion leaders in their communities, people whose judgment others trusted. When they adopted hybrid seeds and demonstrated actual yield improvements, the rest of the community started paying attention. The early majority followed. 34% of farmers who were more deliberate, more cautious. They needed proof. They waited until the innovation had been tested, until the benefits were clear, until adoption felt safe rather than risky. After them came the late majority, another 34%, even more skeptical, even more resistant to change. They adopted only when everyone else had already moved, when staying with the old methods would put them at a disadvantage. And finally the laggards, 16% who held out until they had no choice, until the old seeds weren't even available anymore, until traditional methods had been completely superseded. Rogers plotted this adoption pattern on a graph, and what emerged was a perfect bell curve. The horizontal axis represented time. The vertical axis represented the number of people adopting in each period. The curve started slow, rose to a peak as the majorities adopted, then declined as only laggards remained. But if you looked at cumulative adoption, plotting the total percentage of people who had adopted over time, rather than the rate of adoption in each period, you got a different shape, an S-curve, slow growth at first as innovators and early adopters experimented, then rapid acceleration as the early and late majorities piled in, then a plateau as the market saturated and only laggards remained. This S-curve, this pattern of slow start, rapid growth, then saturation, has appeared in the adoption data for virtually every significant technology introduced over the past 150 years. The question Rogers couldn't fully answer, the question that matters most if you're trying to anticipate the future, is why the S-curve takes the time that it does. Why do some technologies race through the adoption cycle in 5 years, while others require 30 or 40? What determines the speed? And more specifically, why do so many transformative technologies seem to follow a pattern where meaningful adoption, the movement from niche curiosity to mainstream dominance, takes somewhere between 25 and 30 years? The answer isn't simple. It's not just one factor. It's the interaction of infrastructure requirements, capital equipment replacement cycles, generational workforce turnover, network effects, and the time required to build supporting ecosystems. Let me show you how these forces combine to create that 25 to 30-year pattern, and why understanding this timeline gives you a map for predicting which current technologies are about to explode. Start with electricity, because it's the clearest example of the pattern, and because it established infrastructure that every subsequent innovation would build upon. Thomas Edison received a patent for a practical electric light bulb in 1880, but that patent didn't change anything immediately. In 1880, 0 American homes were wired for electricity. 0. The technology existed, but the infrastructure didn't. The first home to receive electric power was J.P. Morgan's New York residence in 1882, and even that required Edison's company to build a custom power generation system specifically for Morgan's house. For electricity to become practical for ordinary people, entire cities needed to be rewired. Power plants had to be built, transmission lines had to be laid, standards had to be established, electricians had to be trained, appliances had to be designed and manufactured. All of this took time, not because the technology was difficult, but because physical infrastructure moves slowly. In 1900, 20 years after Edison's patent, less than 5% of industrial power in the United States came from electricity. Most factories still ran on steam, using belt drive systems powered by central steam engines. By 1907, still only 8% of American homes had electric service. In 1910, a full 30 years after the light bulb patent, only 10% of homes had electricity. But then the pace accelerated. By 1920, 35% of American households had electric service, though the number was much higher in cities, 48%, and much lower in rural areas. By 1929, close to 70% of American homes had electricity, if you counted only urban areas, but only 10% of farms and rural households had access. It wasn't until 1945, after the Rural Electrification Administration had spent a decade extending power lines into the countryside, that 90% of all American households finally had electric service. From practical invention to dominant infrastructure took roughly 60 years total. But from the point where electricity became commercially viable for middle-class households, around 1900, to the point where it reached majority adoption, around 1930, was right at 30 years. And that 30-year window wasn't random. It reflected the time required to build the physical infrastructure, to replace capital equipment in factories, to train a workforce, and to develop the ecosystem of appliances and uses that made electricity valuable enough that people would pay for it. The pattern repeated with automobiles, and here we can see the 25 to 30-year cycle even more clearly, because the starting point is more defined. Carl Benz built the first practical gasoline-powered automobile in 1886, but automobiles remained expensive curiosities for the wealthy until Henry Ford introduced the Model T in 1908. The Model T was the breakthrough. Ford applied assembly line manufacturing to automobile production, cutting the time to build a car from 12 hours to 93 minutes, and reducing the price from around $3,000 to less than $300 by the mid-1920s. In 1908, there were fewer than 200,000 automobiles registered in the entire United States. By 1910, there were still fewer than 50 cars per 10,000 people. But the growth curve was about to steepen dramatically. By 1920, 20% of American families owned automobiles. 9 years later, in 1929, 60% of families had cars. The automobile revolution happened in a single decade, from niche luxury to mass-market necessity. But that explosive decade was preceded by 20 years of gradual infrastructure building. Roads had to be paved, gas stations had to be established, repair shops had to open, traffic laws had to be written, driver training had to become common, the entire ecosystem that makes automobiles practical had to be constructed. And even after 60% adoption in 1929, it took another decade before automobile ownership stabilized as truly universal because the Great Depression interrupted the adoption curve and slowed the replacement of older vehicles. From practical availability to majority adoption, roughly 20 to 25 years. The same pattern again. Now let's examine why this 25 to 30-year window appears so consistently. The first factor is infrastructure investment cycles. Major infrastructure, the roads and power lines and communication networks that enable new technologies to function, gets built in waves. And each wave has a natural lifespan tied to the depreciation schedule and useful life of the capital equipment involved. A power plant built in 1900 was designed to last 25 to 30 years, before major refurbishment or replacement became necessary. The electrical transformers, the transmission towers, the distribution equipment, all of it had useful lives measured in decades, not years. When utilities made these investments, they needed to amortize the costs over long periods, which meant they couldn't simply rebuild everything when a better technology came along. They had to wait until the existing equipment reached the end of its useful life. The same pattern applies to roads, to telecommunications networks, to water systems, to any infrastructure that requires massive capital investment. Once built, it locks in for 25 to 30 years. This creates a natural rhythm where major technological shifts become possible only when infrastructure reaches the point where replacement is economically justified. The second factor is generational workforce turnover. People who learn a technology or a method of working when they're young tend to stick with that approach throughout their careers. An electrician trained in 1900 learned to work with direct current systems. When alternating current became the standard, older electricians had to retrain or retire. The transition didn't happen instantly. It happened as the older generation aged out of the workforce and a new generation, trained from the beginning in AC systems, replaced them. That generational replacement cycle runs roughly 30 years, the time from entering the workforce at age 20 to reaching peak influence at age 50. Major technological transformations require not just new tools, but new ways of thinking, new skills, new assumptions. And those spread most easily through generational replacement rather than retraining. This is why companies often struggle to adopt new technologies, even when they're clearly superior. The existing workforce has expertise in the old systems, and asking them to abandon that expertise and become beginners again is psychologically and economically difficult. The easier path, though slower, is to hire people who learn the new technology from the start and let them gradually replace those who mastered the old approach. The third factor is capital equipment depreciation cycles. Businesses don't replace equipment until it wears out or becomes uneconomical to operate. A factory that invested in steam-powered machinery in 1900 wasn't going to rip it out and replace it with electric motors in 1905 just because the new technology was better. They had to recover their investment first. For most industrial equipment, the depreciation schedule runs 20 to 30 years. That's the window where the equipment generates enough revenue to justify its original cost, and only after that period does replacement make financial sense. This creates a natural adoption lag where businesses wait for equipment to reach the end of its useful life before switching to new technology. And because businesses make major capital investments in waves, triggered by economic cycles and industry trends, equipment replacement happens in waves too. One company switches, demonstrates the benefits, competitors follow, and within a decade an entire industry transforms. But that transformation can't start until the existing equipment base ages into obsolescence, and that takes 25 to 30 years from the previous major investment cycle. The fourth factor is network effects and critical mass. Some technologies become valuable only when enough other people adopt them. The telephone is the classic example. The first telephone was invented in 1876. But one telephone was useless. 2 telephones could connect 2 people. 10 telephones could connect 10 people. But the real value emerged only when thousands, then millions of people had telephones, creating a network where you could reach almost anyone. This meant telephone adoption followed a pattern where early growth was slow because the network wasn't valuable enough yet. Then growth accelerated as the network reached critical mass and became genuinely useful. Then growth slowed again as the market saturated. The time required to reach critical mass, to get enough adoption that the network became valuable for mainstream users, rather than just early adopters, typically ran 20 to 25 years. And that critical mass threshold often aligned with the point where infrastructure investment became justified, where equipment replacement cycles favored the new technology, and where a new generation of workers trained in the technology entered the workforce. All the factors reinforced each other, creating a synchronized transformation that happened within a predictable time frame. Now let's talk about what changes this pattern and what doesn't. Modern technologies often adopt faster than older technologies did, but not as much faster as people think. Smartphones went from introduction to 50% market penetration in about 5 years. The internet reached 50% of American households in roughly 7 years from the point where it became commercially available. Social media platforms like Facebook reached critical mass in even shorter windows. These modern adoption curves are steeper, faster, more compressed. The reason is that modern technologies leverage existing infrastructure, rather than requiring new infrastructure to be built from scratch. Smartphones didn't need new roads or power plants. They used the existing cellular network infrastructure that had been built for basic cell phones, and they used the existing internet backbone that had been built for computers. They were, in effect, new applications running on old infrastructure. This meant they could skip the 20-year infrastructure building phase and jump straight to adoption. But even so, the underlying infrastructure that enables smartphones took decades to build. Cellular networks started development in the 1970s, and didn't reach widespread coverage until the 1990s. The Internet backbone was built starting in the 1980s and reached critical mass in the late 1990s. The apparently instant adoption of smartphones in the 2000s was only possible because decades of infrastructure investment had already occurred. The 25 to 30-year cycle didn't disappear. It just shifted to the infrastructure layer. Historical data shows this compression clearly. It took electricity 30 years to reach 10% household adoption, starting from commercial availability. It took telephones 35 years to reach 25% household penetration. It took automobiles about 20 years to go from practical introduction to 20% adoption. But modern technologies show different patterns. Computers took 16 years to reach significant adoption. The Internet took 7 years. Smartphones took 5 years. Each generation of technology adopts faster because it builds on infrastructure from previous generations. But here's what hasn't changed. The underlying capital cycles, the generational workforce turnover, the time required to build supporting ecosystems, those still operate on 25 to 30-year timescales. We're just seeing different layers of the stack transform at different speeds. The application layer now changes in years. The infrastructure layer still changes in decades. Let me give you a concrete example of how this plays out today. Electric vehicles are following the classic 25 to 30-year pattern, even though they leverage existing road infrastructure. Tesla introduced the Roadster in 2008 and the Model S in 2012. In 2011, global electric vehicle sales were 50,000 units. By 2023, they reached 10.5 million units, about 14% of total car sales. That's rapid growth, but it's happening within a predictable framework. The infrastructure requirements for electric vehicles are different from gasoline cars. Charging stations need to be built. Electrical grids need to be upgraded to handle the increased load. Mechanics need to learn how to service electric drivetrains. Supply chains for batteries need to scale. Battery recycling infrastructure needs to be developed. All of this takes time. If you trace the S-curve for electric vehicles, you can predict with reasonable confidence that they'll reach 50% market share somewhere between 2030 and 2035, roughly 25 to 30 years after the first mass-market electric vehicles became available. The underlying pattern hasn't changed. It's just compressed compared to the adoption curves from a century ago because much of the required infrastructure already exists. The pattern appears even in software and digital technologies, though in less obvious ways. Artificial intelligence research has been ongoing since the 1950s. Neural networks were developed in the 1980s, but AI remained a research curiosity with limited practical applications for decades. Then, starting around 2012, advances in computing power, data availability, and algorithm design triggered an acceleration phase. By 2022, AI tools like ChatGPT demonstrated capabilities that suggested genuine transformation. If you date the beginning of the modern AI era to around 2012, when deep learning breakthroughs started occurring regularly, we're now roughly 13 years into what will likely be a 25 to 30-year adoption cycle. The infrastructure that AI requires is being built now. Data centers are being upgraded, training data sets are being compiled, regulatory frameworks are being developed, new jobs and skills are emerging, workforce transformation is underway. If the pattern holds, AI will reach dominant status, the point where it's integrated into most aspects of business and daily life, somewhere around 2037 to 2042. The speed of development is faster than previous technologies, but the speed of full integration into society still follows the 25 to 30-year timeline. Here's why this matters for anyone trying to anticipate the future or identify investment opportunities. The adoption curve isn't smooth. It has identifiable inflection points, moments where the rate of change accelerates or where the technology crosses a threshold that makes widespread adoption inevitable. The first inflection point comes when the technology demonstrates clear advantages over what it replaces. For electricity, this was when electric motors proved more efficient than steam engines. For automobiles, this was when the Model T brought prices down to middle-class affordability. For smartphones, this was when the iPhone demonstrated that a phone could be a genuinely useful computer, rather than just a communication device. The second inflection point comes when infrastructure reaches critical mass. For electricity, this was when enough cities had power grids that appliance manufacturers could profitably build electric devices. For automobiles, This was when enough roads were paved and gas stations existed that cars became practical for daily use rather than just recreation. For smartphones, this was when cellular data networks became fast enough and cheap enough that mobile internet access became practical. The third inflection point comes when the technology moves from early adopters to the early majority, the point where mainstream consumers start adopting en masse. This is the moment when adoption accelerates most dramatically, when the S-curve enters its steep growth phase. If you can identify where a technology sits on this curve, you can predict its trajectory with reasonable confidence. Technologies that have demonstrated clear advantages and are building infrastructure but haven't yet reached mainstream adoption are positioned for explosive growth. Technologies that have reached mainstream adoption and are approaching market saturation are entering the mature phase where growth slows. Technologies that are still experimental, still proving their advantages, are years away from mainstream impact regardless of how exciting they seem. The timeline from initial demonstration to majority adoption for technologies that require significant infrastructure or behavior change runs 25 to 30 years with remarkable consistency. This is not because of some mystical property of that time frame. It's because that time frame aligns with capital equipment replacement cycles, generational workforce turnover, and the time required to build supporting infrastructure and ecosystems. Understanding this pattern gives you a framework for evaluation. When someone claims a new technology will transform the world in 5 years, you can assess whether that's realistic based on where the technology sits on the adoption curve and what infrastructure and supporting systems still need to be built. Let me walk you through a current example to show how this framework applies in practice. Autonomous vehicles have been in development since the 1980s, but practical demonstrations started appearing around 2009 when Google began testing self-driving cars. Initial optimism suggested autonomous vehicles would be widespread by 2020. That prediction failed because it ignored the adoption curve dynamics. Autonomous vehicles require not just technical capability, but also regulatory frameworks, insurance models, infrastructure modifications like smart traffic signals, public acceptance, and business models that make them economically viable. In 2025, we're roughly 16 years into the autonomous vehicle development cycle if we date it from Google's 2009 demonstrations. The technology has proven its advantages in controlled environments. Some infrastructure is being built, but we're still in the early adopter phase, not even close to the early majority. If the pattern holds, autonomous vehicles won't reach majority adoption until somewhere around 2030. 4 to 2039, roughly 25 to 30 years from the initial practical demonstrations. Companies that expected faster adoption overestimated the speed at which infrastructure could be built and underestimated the time required for regulatory and social adaptation. Companies that understand the 25 to 30-year cycle are positioning for long-term success rather than expecting instant transformation. Now let's examine why some technologies seem to break this pattern and adopt much faster. Social media platforms went from launch to billions of users in less than a decade. Streaming services displaced physical media in roughly 15 years. Mobile payment systems gained critical mass in some markets in 5 years. What makes these technologies different? The common factor is that they required minimal new infrastructure. Facebook didn't need to lay cables or build power plants. It ran on the existing internet infrastructure that had taken decades to build. Streaming services used the existing broadband networks that cable companies and telecommunications firms had spent billions developing. Mobile payments leveraged existing smartphone adoption and banking infrastructure. These technologies were, in engineering terms, applications rather than platforms. They ran on infrastructure that had already been built. And because they didn't require physical infrastructure investment or capital equipment replacement, they could diffuse much faster once they demonstrated clear advantages. But notice that even these fast-adopting technologies still required supporting ecosystem development. Facebook needed advertising infrastructure to become profitable. Streaming services needed content production systems and licensing frameworks. Mobile payments needed security protocols and merchant adoption. The ecosystem building still took time, just less time than physical infrastructure requires. This distinction between platform technologies and application technologies is crucial for prediction. Platform technologies, those that require new infrastructure or fundamental changes in physical systems, follow the 25 to 30-year adoption pattern. Application technologies, those that run on existing infrastructure, can adopt much faster, sometimes in 5 to 10 years, but the infrastructure they depend on still took decades to build. We're often fooled into thinking adoption is faster than it really is because we only notice the application layer. We see Facebook grow from 0 to billions of users in a decade and conclude that modern technology adoption is instantaneous. But Facebook was only possible because decades of investment had already created the internet backbone, the personal computer installed base, and the broadband connections that made social networking practical. The underlying platform took the standard 25 to 30 years. The application that ran on top of it could then move quickly. This framework helps explain why some predictions about technology transformation turn out to be wildly wrong. In the 1990s, many people predicted that video conferencing would quickly replace business travel and transform how companies operated. The technology existed, it worked reasonably well, but adoption remained limited for another 20 years. Why? Because video conferencing required infrastructure that didn't exist yet. Broadband connections weren't universal, video compression wasn't efficient, the cost was too high, the quality wasn't good enough. It took until the 2010s for the infrastructure to mature to the point where video conferencing became practical for routine use rather than just special occasions. Then, when the COVID pandemic forced rapid adoption in 2020, the infrastructure was finally in place to support it. The technology had been ready for 20 years. The infrastructure had only recently caught up. The adoption that seemed instant in 2020 was actually the culmination of 30 years of infrastructure building. We're seeing the same pattern play out with various current technologies. Virtual reality has been promised for decades. The technology exists, devices are available, but adoption remains limited because the infrastructure isn't there yet. The content ecosystem is thin, the use cases are narrow, the price is high, the social acceptance is low. These barriers will diminish over time as infrastructure develops, as costs decline, as use cases expand. But that process follows the standard timeline. If we date the current generation of VR from the Oculus Rift in 2012, we're 13 years in. Expect another 12 to 17 years before VR reaches majority adoption, if it ever does. The technology needs to prove advantages compelling enough to justify the infrastructure investment. That's still uncertain. Cryptocurrency and blockchain technology provide another current example. Bitcoin launched in 2009. 16 years later, adoption remains limited to a relatively small group of enthusiasts, speculators, and specific use cases. The technology has proven certain advantages, particularly for international transfers and for people in countries with unstable currencies. But the infrastructure for widespread adoption isn't built yet. Regulatory frameworks are unclear. Integration with existing financial systems is limited. Use cases for ordinary people remain narrow. Energy consumption is controversial. If cryptocurrency is going to reach mainstream adoption, it will follow the standard pattern. Clear demonstration of advantages, check. Infrastructure building in progress. Early adopter phase, current status. Movement to early majority, probably another 10 to 15 years if it happens at all. The fact that we're 16 years in and still in early adopter phase suggests either that the advantages aren't compelling enough to drive mainstream adoption, or that the infrastructure requirements are larger than initially expected. Either way, predictions of imminent cryptocurrency domination misunderstand the adoption curve dynamics. Here's what this means, practically for anyone trying to anticipate the future of technology markets. First, identify what type of technology you're evaluating. Is it a platform that requires new infrastructure, or an application that runs on existing infrastructure? Platform technologies will follow the 25 to 30-year adoption curve. Application technologies can move faster, but only if the underlying platform is mature. Second, identify where the technology sits on the adoption curve. Has it demonstrated clear advantages over existing alternatives? Is infrastructure being built? Has it moved beyond early adopters into the early majority? The answers tell you how much time remains before mainstream impact. Third, look at the capital cycles and generational dynamics. Are there obvious barriers related to equipment replacement timelines or workforce training requirements? These create natural speed limits regardless of how exciting the technology seems. Fourth, examine the ecosystem requirements. What supporting systems and complementary technologies need to exist before this innovation can reach its full potential. Missing ecosystem elements add years to the adoption timeline. Let me show you how to apply this framework to a current technology that's generating enormous attention. Artificial intelligence and large language models burst into public consciousness with ChatGPT's release in November 2022. The capabilities were stunning. Within months, everyone was discussing how AI would transform every industry. Predictions suggested that jobs would disappear within years, that entire business models would collapse, that the world would change faster than anyone could imagine. Now, let's apply the adoption curve framework. AI research has been ongoing for 70 years. Neural networks have been studied for 40 years. The deep learning breakthrough that enabled modern AI happened around 2012. We're 13 years into the modern AI era. ChatGPT and similar models represent the moment when AI demonstrated clear advantages for ordinary users rather than just researchers. This is similar to the moment when the Model T made automobiles practical for the middle class, or when the iPhone made smartphones useful for everyone rather than just business users. It's the inflection point that triggers the steep part of the adoption curve. But we're still early in that steep part. Infrastructure is being built now. Data centers are being expanded to handle AI workloads. Companies are beginning to integrate AI into their workflows. Regulatory frameworks are being discussed. New jobs related to AI training and management are emerging. Educational programs are being developed. This infrastructure building phase will take years, not months. The capital cycle constraints are real. Companies that invested heavily in traditional software infrastructure in the 2010s won't abandon those investments instantly. They'll wait for refresh cycles, typically 5 to 7 years for enterprise software and 10 to 20 years for core systems. The generational workforce dynamic is also real. Workers who built their careers on pre-AI skills won't instantly transform into AI experts. A new generation entering the workforce will have AI skills from day one, but that generation needs 15 to 20 years to reach positions of significant organizational influence. The ecosystem requirements are substantial. AI models need data, and creating high-quality training datasets requires time and effort. AI systems need to integrate with existing business processes, and that integration requires custom software development. AI outputs need to be evaluated and refined, requiring human expertise. Legal and ethical frameworks need to be established. All of this takes time. If we date the beginning of mainstream AI adoption to 2022, when ChatGPT launched, and we apply the standard 25 to 30-year adoption curve, AI should reach dominant status, the point where it's integrated into most aspects of business and daily life, around 2047 to 2052. Does that mean AI won't matter for 25 years? No, it means AI will follow the standard pattern, rapid growth in the next decade as early majority adopters integrate it into their operations, continued expansion over the following decade as late majority adopters join in, full maturity and ubiquity by the late 2040s. The timeline isn't about the technology being slow to develop. The technology is developing rapidly. The timeline is about the pace at which infrastructure can be built, capital equipment can be replaced, workforces can adapt, and ecosystems can mature. Those processes run on decades, not years. Here's the crucial insight that most people miss. The adoption curve isn't about technology development speed. It's about social and economic integration speed. Engineers can build new technologies rapidly, but integrating those technologies into the fabric of how society operates requires changing physical infrastructure, replacing capital equipment, retraining workforces, building supporting ecosystems, developing regulatory frameworks, and allowing time for business models and use cases to evolve through trial and error. All of those processes have natural timescales that haven't changed much despite the acceleration of pure technology development. We can build a new microchip in 2 years that's 10 times more powerful than the previous generation, but we can't rebuild the electrical grid in 2 years. We can't replace every piece of capital equipment in every factory in 2 years. We can't retrain the entire workforce in 2 years. We can't evolve entirely new business models and social practices in 2 years. These processes require time measured in decades. This is why the 25 to 30-year adoption cycle persists even as technology development accelerates. The constraint isn't how fast we can build new things. The constraint is how fast we can integrate new things into existing systems. And that integration speed is limited by capital depreciation schedules, infrastructure replacement cycles, generational workforce turnover, and ecosystem maturation timelines. These factors operated the same way 100 years ago when electricity was spreading. They operate the same way today when AI is spreading. The technologies change, the adoption dynamics remain remarkably constant. Understanding this pattern gives you a powerful predictive tool. When a new technology appears, you can estimate its timeline to mainstream impact by identifying what infrastructure it requires, what capital equipment needs to be replaced, what workforce skills need to develop, and what ecosystem needs to be built. Add those timelines together, and you typically get something close to 25 to 30 years from initial demonstration to dominant market position. Now let me bring this forward to help you identify which technologies today are positioned for explosive growth in the next decade. The technologies to watch are those that demonstrated clear advantages 5 to 10 years ago and have been building infrastructure since then. They're entering or approaching the early majority adoption phase, where growth accelerates dramatically. They're far enough along that the infrastructure is becoming practical, but not so far along that the market is saturated. Electric vehicles fit this pattern. Clear advantages demonstrated around 2012. Infrastructure building throughout the 2010s. Approaching early majority adoption now. Expect explosive growth through the late 2020s as they move from 14% market share to 50% plus. Renewable energy fits this pattern. Solar and wind demonstrated clear cost advantages around 2010 to 2015. Infrastructure has been building steadily. Grid integration is becoming practical. Energy storage is scaling. Expect continued rapid growth through the 2030s as renewables move from 20% of generation to dominant position. Advanced manufacturing techniques like additive manufacturing fit this pattern. The technology was demonstrated in the 2000s. Infrastructure and expertise have been building throughout the 2010s and 2020s. Adoption is accelerating as the technology proves advantages for specific applications. Expect widespread integration throughout the 2030s. The technologies to be skeptical about are those that seem exciting, but are still in the experimental phase, still proving advantages, still far from having the infrastructure required for mainstream adoption. Quantum computing remains experimental. Applications are limited. Infrastructure doesn't exist. Timeline to mainstream impact is probably 15 to 20 years minimum. Brain-computer interfaces remain experimental. Medical and regulatory barriers are substantial. Infrastructure requirements are enormous. Timeline to anything beyond narrow medical applications is probably 20 plus years. Space tourism and space industrialization remain experimental. Costs are too high. Infrastructure is minimal. Business models are unproven. Timeline to mass market impact is decades away. These technologies may eventually transform their domains, but they're too early in the adoption curve for near-term explosive growth. The infrastructure building phase alone will take another decade or more. Here's what makes this framework so valuable. It lets you distinguish between technologies that will matter soon and technologies that will matter eventually. Both categories can be important, but they require different strategies. Technologies approaching the steep part of the adoption curve, technologies that have demonstrated advantages and built infrastructure and are entering early majority adoption, those are positioned for explosive growth in the next 5 to 10 years. Technologies still in the experimental or early adopter phase, regardless of how exciting they seem, won't reach mainstream impact for another 15 to 25 years. If you're trying to anticipate market opportunities, if you're trying to position a business for the future, if you're trying to invest in technologies that will define the next decade, the adoption curve framework tells you where to focus. Don't chase the newest, most exciting thing. Chase the thing that's 5 to 10 years old, that has proven advantages, that has spent the last several years building infrastructure, and that's approaching the point where mainstream adoption accelerates. That's where the explosive growth happens. That's where the opportunities are largest. The pattern is so consistent it's almost mechanical. New technology appears. Innovators experiment for 2 to 5 years. Early adopters validate and demonstrate advantages for another 5 to 7 years. Infrastructure gets built over the next 7 to 10 years. Early majority adoption triggers explosive growth that lasts another 7 to 10 years. Late majority adoption continues expansion for another 5 to 7 years. Total timeline from initial appearance to market saturation, 25 to 30 years. The speeds vary slightly based on infrastructure requirements, and whether the technology is a platform or an application. But the general pattern holds across electricity, automobiles, telephones, televisions, computers, the internet, smartphones, and now artificial intelligence and electric vehicles. It's not magic. It's the interaction of capital cycles, infrastructure timelines, generational, dynamics, and ecosystem development. And it's predictable. The 25 to 30-year cycle isn't a limit imposed by physics or human creativity. It's a limit imposed by the practical realities of how society integrates change. We can't rebuild physical infrastructure overnight. We can't force businesses to abandon capital equipment before it wears out. We can't retrain entire workforces instantly. We can't develop mature ecosystems without trial and error taking time. These constraints operated 100 years ago, and they operate today. And they'll likely continue operating for decades to come. So when you hear someone claim that a technology will transform everything in 3 years, check where that technology sits on the adoption curve. If it hasn't yet demonstrated clear advantages, if infrastructure hasn't been built, if early majority adoption hasn't started, then the timeline is wrong. Transformation will take longer, maybe much longer. Conversely, when you see a technology that demonstrated advantages 5 to 10 years ago, that has been steadily building infrastructure, that's starting to move from early adopters to early majority, that's when you should pay closest attention. Because that technology is entering the explosive growth phase of the adoption curve, and the next decade will see it transform from interesting innovation to dominant force. Understanding this pattern, recognizing where technologies sit on the curve, identifying which are approaching inflection points, that's how you see the future before it arrives. That's how you position for transformation, while others are still debating whether it will happen. The cycle is real, the timeline is predictable, and the opportunities belong to those who understand the pattern and act while others are still watching and waiting. If understanding the innovation adoption cycle changed how you see technology markets, if you finally grasp why some predictions fail while others come true, if you recognize the pattern that determines which technologies are about to explode, then subscribe to see more analysis of the economic cycles and patterns that shape our world. Because once you understand the timelines, once you see the mechanism, you stop being surprised by how the future unfolds. You start anticipating it. And that gives you the opportunity to position yourself ahead of the transformation, rather than scrambling to catch up after it's already happened.